The courtroom smells like old wood and bitter coffee, the kind that sits too long in the pot, and I'm sitting at the defendant's table with my hands folded so tight in my lap that my knuckles have turned white, listening to my husband's attorney describe me as emotionally unstable, forgetful, and completely unfit to manage our finances or make rational decisions about my own future. My name, Evelyn Parker, echoes through the room when she says it, but it doesn't sound like me anymore. Doesn't sound like the woman who raised 3 children or managed a household budget for 32 years, or kept peace between her husband and his difficult mother. The judge, a tired-looking woman in her 60s with reading glasses perched on her nose, is preparing to rule, shuffling papers with the resigned efficiency of someone who's heard too many sad stories. When my 12-year-old granddaughter Bailey slowly stands up from the gallery, her voice shaking but clear as she asks if she can play something she recorded on her phone. A few people in the courtroom actually chuckle, thinking it's some kind of childish interruption, and my mother-in-law Eleanor smiles that tight, confident smile she wears when she thinks she's already won. While my husband Derek turns around confused, his attorney reaching for his arm to sit him back down. But the judge hesitates, looks at Bailey's serious face, and nods slowly, saying the child may approach. Bailey walks forward with her phone clutched in both hands, and the bailiff helps her connect it to the courtroom's speaker system. And when the recording begins to play, the room goes completely silent within the first 5 seconds. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Because what's coming through those speakers is my mother-in-law's voice, crystal clear, saying words I never thought I'd hear confirmed out loud. I sit frozen as the courtroom holds its breath, and I realize in that moment that everything I suspected, everything I thought I was imagining, every time I questioned my own sanity over the past 8 months, was real, was documented, was about to be exposed in front of a judge who suddenly looks very interested. My attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Cole, who took my case when 3 other lawyers said it looked too difficult to win, leans forward with her pen hovering over her notepad, and I can see her trying not to smile, trying to maintain professional composure, but her eyes are bright with the kind of recognition that comes when evidence you desperately needed just fell into your lap. I want to look at Bailey, want to ask her where this came from and how long she's had it and why she never told me, but I can't move. Can't turn my head, can only sit there listening as my entire marriage unravels in real time. Let me back up 6 months to explain how I ended up here. Sitting in a courtroom fighting for basic dignity, while strangers decide if I'm competent enough to manage my own life. The divorce began on a Tuesday evening in June. No shouting, no dishes thrown, no dramatic confrontation. Just Derek coming home from work at his mother's accounting firm, sitting down at the kitchen table where I'd made his favorite dinner, and telling me quietly that our marriage was over and that it was for the best, and that his mother Eleanor would help us handle the details professionally. I remember staring at him, fork halfway to my mouth, waiting for him to laugh or explain the joke. But his face was serious, almost rehearsed, like he'd practiced the speech in the mirror. And when I asked why, what happened, what did I do wrong, he just shook his head and said we'd grown apart and that I'd understand eventually and that fighting would only make things harder on the kids. From that exact moment, I stopped being Derek's wife and became a problem to be managed, a situation to be handled, a complication in whatever plan had already been set in motion without my knowledge or consent. Documents started appearing that I didn't remember signing, conversations happened in rooms I wasn't invited to, and Eleanor moved into our guest bedroom temporarily to help with the transition. Which meant she was there for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, watching everything I did. Eleanor Parker had always been a difficult woman, the kind who smiled while correcting you, who offered help that felt like criticism, who kept mental scorecards of every favor given and every slight received. But I'd tolerated her for 3 decades, because that's what you do when you love someone and want peace in your family. She raised Derek alone after his father died young, built a successful accounting practice, and never let anyone forget how hard she'd worked or how much she'd sacrificed. And Derek worshipped her in that quiet, desperate way men sometimes worship the mothers who never quite approved of their choices. When she moved into our house after Derek announced the divorce, she arrived with 2 suitcases, a laptop, and a leather folder full of papers I wasn't allowed to see, and within 48 hours she'd reorganized the kitchen, rearranged the living room furniture, and started keeping a notebook where she wrote down everything I did. What time I woke up, what I ate, whether I remembered to water the plants, if I seemed emotional or confused during normal conversations. She'd sit at the dining table in the morning with her coffee and her reading glasses, writing in that notebook, and when I asked what she was documenting, she'd smile sweetly and say she was just keeping track of household tasks so nothing got forgotten. But the way she watched me felt clinical, methodical, like a scientist observing a specimen that might do something interesting if provoked enough. The gaslighting started small. So small I almost missed it. Little comments here and there about how I seemed tired or distracted or forgetful, observations delivered with concern rather than cruelty, which made them harder to defend against. Because what kind of person argues with someone who's supposedly worried about them? Eleanor would mention that I'd told her something I had no memory of saying, or she'd move my keys and then act confused when I couldn't find them, suggesting gently that I must have put them somewhere unusual. Or she'd schedule appointments and claim she'd told me about them days earlier, and seemed hurt when I had no recollection. Derek started repeating her observations, saying things like, "Mom's right, you do seem more forgetful lately," or "Maybe you should see a doctor about the stress." And I'd find myself second-guessing every memory, every conversation, wondering if I really was losing pieces of time or if something else was happening. The real shift came when legal documents started appearing. Papers about temporary financial arrangements and custody schedules for our adult children's visits, forms that needed my signature, and when I hesitated or asked questions, Eleanor would sigh and explain everything so slowly, so carefully, treating me like a child who needed simple words and patient repetition, until I felt stupid for not understanding and signed just to make the condescension stop. Within 3 months of Derek filing for divorce, temporary court orders had stripped me of access to our joint accounts, given Derek exclusive use of our family home, and restricted my ability to make any financial decisions without approval from his attorney. I was living in our house, but no longer allowed to touch the money I'd helped earn and save for 30 years. Couldn't pay bills or buy groceries without asking Derek for an allowance like a teenager with a strict father. And the court papers cited my demonstrated instability and concerning memory issues as justification for these restrictions. My attorney at the time, a young man fresh out of law school who'd seemed confident during our initial consultation, advised me to accept the temporary orders without fighting because judges don't like contentious divorces, and if I seemed cooperative, it would help my case later. So I agreed. I signed. I let them take control of everything because I trusted the system and believed that truth would eventually matter. I started doubting myself in ways I never had before, wondering if maybe Derek and Eleanor were right, if maybe I was unstable, if maybe the stress really had affected my mind, because how else could I explain the disconnection between who I knew I was and who everyone kept telling me I'd become? I'd wake up at 3 in the morning in the guest bedroom of my own house, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember if I'd really said the things Eleanor claimed I'd said, or if I'd really forgotten the appointments Derek swore I'd agreed to. And the uncertainty felt like standing on shifting sand with nothing solid to grab onto. The only person who still saw me clearly during those months was Bailey, my oldest son's daughter, who stayed with us frequently because her parents both worked long hours and needed reliable childcare. Bailey was quiet, observant, the kind of kid who did her homework without being asked and noticed things adults assumed didn't register, and she'd been staying at our house 2 or 3 nights a week since she was 7 years old. Enough that she had her own room and her own routine, and felt completely comfortable in our space. She watched everything that summer and fall, sitting at the kitchen table doing math problems while Eleanor took notes on my behavior. standing in the hallway while Derek and his mother discussed the situation in low voices. Present, but invisible, in the way children often are, when adults forget to guard their words. I didn't realize how much she was absorbing, didn't understand that her 12-year-old brain was processing the strangeness of her grandmother being treated like a problem, the wrongness of adults speaking about someone they claim to love with cold calculation rather than warmth. Bailey and I had always been close, had always had easy, quiet conversations about school and books and her worries about fitting in, and even during the worst months when I questioned everything about myself, she never looked at me like I was broken or confused or less than I'd always been. And that steady belief in me became the only mirror I trusted. It happened on a Wednesday night in September, 3 months into the divorce proceedings, when Derek and Eleanor thought Bailey was asleep upstairs, but she'd actually come down quietly to get water and heard them talking in Derek's study with the door half closed. Eleanor's voice was clear and confident, not the careful, concerned tone she used when I was around, and Bailey heard her say, "She's breaking down exactly like we planned, another month and she'll sign anything just to make it stop." And Derek laughed, actually laughed, and said, "I almost feel bad, but you were right, Mom. This is the cleanest way to handle it." Bailey stood frozen in the hallway with her empty water glass, her heart pounding, not entirely understanding what she was hearing, but knowing instinctively that something terrible was being discussed. And she did something incredibly smart for a 12-year-old. She pulled out her phone, opened the voice recorder app, and pressed record. The conversation continued for 17 minutes. Eleanor and Derek discussing their strategy like business partners reviewing a project, talking about how to exaggerate my mental health issues, how to position me for a bad settlement, how to keep her quiet for the family's sake, by making me feel like any resistance was proof of instability. Bailey recorded all of it, standing perfectly still in that dark hallway, and when they finally finished talking and Eleanor said goodnight to Derek, Bailey slipped back upstairs and saved the file with shaking hands. Bailey didn't tell me about the recording immediately, didn't show it to her parents or mention it to anyone, and for weeks I had no idea that evidence of the conspiracy against me existed on a child's phone tucked under her pillow. She kept recording whenever she was at the house and heard Derek and Eleanor talking, accumulated 4 separate files over 6 weeks. Audio evidence of them planning how to exhaust me emotionally, how to delay proceedings until I gave up, how to make sure I walked away from the marriage with as little as possible while appearing reasonable and concerned. The recordings captured Eleanor coaching Derek on what to say in court, reminding him to emphasize my forgetfulness and emotional reactions, telling him which examples to give the judge, to paint a picture of someone unreliable and unstable. They captured discussions about my medication history, about that one time 15 years ago when I'd taken anxiety medication after my father died, and how they could frame that as a pattern of mental health problems rather than a normal grief response. Bailey understood enough to know these conversations were wrong, knew that her grandmother was being hurt, but she was also 12 and scared, and didn't know who to trust with something this serious. So she held on to the files and waited, hoping someone would ask the right question or that an opportunity would present itself where the truth could matter. The divorce hearing was scheduled for December, 6 months after Derek first announced he was leaving, and by that point I'd been worn down to almost nothing, living in the guest bedroom of my own house, asking permission to buy groceries, watching Eleanor document my every move in her terrible notebook. The hearing was supposed to be routine, just a formalization of the temporary orders that had already stripped me of financial control and dignity. And my new attorney, Patricia, who'd taken over my case after the first lawyer quit, had warned me that judges rarely reversed temporary orders without compelling new evidence. I sat in that courtroom feeling defeated before we even started. Watching Derek and Eleanor sit together at their table, looking calm and united, while I sat alone, except for Patricia. And when Derek's attorney began her presentation, painting me as someone who couldn't manage money or make rational decisions, describing incidents I barely remembered, or that had been twisted beyond recognition. I felt myself disappearing. My mother-in-law sat in the gallery behind Derek's table, hands folded, that slight smile on her face, the smile of someone watching a plan come together perfectly. And I thought about how she'd systematically destroyed my credibility over 6 months, how she'd used her own son to do it, how she'd smiled while dismantling me piece by piece for reasons I still didn't fully understand. The judge, Honorable Ruth Cameron, was listening carefully to Derek's attorney describe my supposed mental decline when Bailey stood up from where she'd been sitting quietly in the back row with my son Andrew and his wife. The sudden movement caught everyone's attention, and Bailey's voice, young but steady, cut through the formal courtroom atmosphere when she said, "Excuse me, Your Honor, I have something I need to play." A few people actually chuckled, probably thinking this was some kind of childish interruption, some recording of a school project or a misunderstanding about how courts work, and I saw Eleanor's smile widen slightly. Saw her exchange a look with Derek that said, "This won't matter, this is just a child." But Judge Cameron, who had grandchildren of her own, I'd later learn, looked at Bailey's serious face and the way she was clutching her phone, and instead of dismissing her immediately, the judge asked what kind of recording it was. Bailey said clearly, voice only shaking a little, "It's recordings of my dad and my other grandmother talking about Grandma Evelyn, about how they're trying to make her seem unstable when she's not." The courtroom shifted, the casual confidence draining from Derek's table, and Eleanor's smile finally flickered and died as Judge Cameron gestured for Bailey to approach the bench. The bailiff helped Bailey connect her phone to the courtroom's audio system, and when the first recording started playing, the change in the room was instant and electric. Eleanor's voice coming through the speakers, confident and calculating, saying, "She'll crumble, she always does. Just keep the pressure steady and she'll sign anything to make it stop." The judge's pen stopped moving, her head tilted slightly toward the speaker, and every person in that courtroom went completely still. The kind of silence where you can hear fabric rustling and someone's watch ticking 3 rows back. Derek's attorney tried to object, stood up and started saying something about improper evidence and chain of custody. But Judge Cameron raised one hand and said firmly, "I'm going to hear this," and the recording continued. Eleanor and Derek discussing me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. I sat frozen, hearing my own husband agree with his mother about the best ways to break me down, hearing him laugh about how I'd started questioning my own memory, and something inside me that had been bending for 6 months finally hardened into steel. Patricia put her hand over mine on the table, a brief squeeze of solidarity and warning not to react visibly. But I could see her making notes rapidly, underlining things, drawing arrows, building a case in real time from evidence she hadn't known existed an hour ago. The recording played for maybe 90 seconds before Derek jumped up, his chair scraping loud against the floor, saying, "Your Honor, this is completely out of context. My mother was just concerned about my wife's well-being. This doesn't mean what it sounds like." Eleanor was shaking her head vigorously, her confident composure cracking, demanding that the recording be stopped because it was misleading and edited and clearly coached by my attorney, throwing accusations that made no sense because Patricia had been as surprised as everyone else when Bailey stood up. Judge Cameron looked at Derek, then at Eleanor, then back at Bailey, and asked in a calm, measured voice, "Young lady, who made these recordings?" Bailey answered without hesitation, "I did, Your Honor, at my dad's house when I was staying there, because I heard them talking about Grandma and it sounded wrong." The judge's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes, a recognition that a child had witnessed something disturbing enough to document it, and she asked if there were more recordings. Bailey nodded and said, "Yes, ma'am, I have 4 of them from different nights." Judge Cameron looked at Derek's attorney and said, "We're going to hear all of them." Bailey stood at the speaker system, small and serious, while the bailiff helped her play the remaining 3 recordings in sequence, and with each one, the courtroom grew heavier, the evidence mounting into something Derek and Eleanor couldn't explain away or dismiss. The second recording captured Eleanor coaching Derek on what to emphasize in his testimony, telling him to mention specific incidents and frame them as patterns rather than isolated events, to use words like concerning and progressive decline, because judges respond to clinical language. The third recording had Eleanor discussing my anxiety medication from 15 years ago, saying they should present it as ongoing mental health issues, even though I hadn't taken anything stronger than aspirin in over a decade. The fourth and longest recording, 17 minutes of Derek and Eleanor planning how to position me for a bad settlement, how to delay proceedings until I was too exhausted to fight, how to keep me isolated and dependent, was the one that made even the court reporter look up from her machine with obvious discomfort. When the last recording ended, the silence in the courtroom felt different than before. Not shocked anymore, but angry. A collective recognition that something deeply wrong had been presented as normal legal strategy. Bailey unplugged her phone with steady hands and walked back to her seat, and I wanted to run to her, to thank her, to apologize that she'd had to carry this knowledge alone. But I stayed seated because court was still in session, and we weren't done yet. Judge Cameron removed her glasses slowly, cleaned them with a cloth from her desk, and put them back on while everyone waited, the tension in the room stretching like a wire about to snap. She looked at Derek's attorney first and said, "Counsel, do you have an explanation for what we just heard?" Derek's attorney stammered something about private conversations being taken out of context, about the stress of divorce making people say things they don't mean, but even she sounded uncertain, like she was realizing her client had misrepresented the situation from the beginning. Then Judge Cameron turned to Derek directly, bypassing the attorney, and asked, "Mr. Parker, did you and your mother discuss ways to make your wife appear mentally unstable in order to gain advantage in these proceedings?" Derek opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Eleanor for help that didn't come, and finally said weakly, "We were concerned about her ability to handle stress, Your Honor. We weren't trying to manipulate anything." The judge's expression was carved from stone when she replied, "That's not what I heard in those recordings, Mr. Parker. What I heard was calculated attempts to gaslight and exhaust someone you took vows to protect." Eleanor tried to interrupt, rising from her seat in the gallery, saying, "Your Honor, I was only trying to help my son through a difficult time." But Judge Cameron cut her off sharply with, "Sit down, ma'am. You're not a party to this case, and I haven't given you permission to speak." The power in that courtroom had shifted completely. The solid ground Derek and Eleanor had been standing on, turning to quicksand under their feet, and Judge Cameron was no longer the tired judge rushing through another divorce, but someone who'd just witnessed evidence of what she clearly considered abuse disguised as concern. She questioned Derek for another 10 minutes, asking about specific incidents his attorney had mentioned earlier, about my supposed memory problems and emotional instability, and Derek contradicted himself twice, stumbled over his timeline, couldn't provide concrete examples when pressed for details. His attorney kept trying to redirect, to reframe, to salvage something from the wreckage. But every answer Derek gave dug the hole deeper, because now the judge was listening with suspicion instead of neutral professionalism. When Judge Cameron asked about the financial restrictions they'd requested, about why I needed supervised access to money I'd helped accumulate over 30 years, Derek actually said, "My mother thought it would be safer," and didn't seem to realize how damning that sounded, how it proved he'd been following Eleanor's script rather than making his own decisions. After 15 minutes of this, Judge Cameron called a recess, told everyone to stay in the building, and disappeared into her chambers with her law clerk trailing behind. And the silence she left was thick with dread for some people and hope for others. During the recess, I stayed in the courtroom while most people filtered out to the hallway, and I could hear Derek and Eleanor talking in urgent whispers near the door. Eleanor insisting that the judge was overreacting and that this won't matter in the final analysis, because judges see emotional cases every day and don't let them influence legal decisions. Derek sounded less certain, kept saying, "She heard us laughing about breaking her down, Mom. That doesn't look good." But Eleanor waved him off with that dismissive gesture she used when she'd already decided she was right. I watched them through the doorway, saw Eleanor straighten Derek's tie and whisper something that made him nod, saw her pat his shoulder like a coach sending a player back onto the field, and I felt a wave of exhaustion so complete I wanted to put my head down on the table and sleep for a week. Patricia came back with 2 bottles of water, handed me one, and said quietly, "Whatever happens next, those recordings changed everything. Bailey gave us leverage I didn't think we'd have." I took a sip of water and asked, "Do you think the judge believed it?" And Patricia looked at me seriously and said, "Evelyn, she didn't just believe it, she was horrified by it. I've been practicing family law for 12 years and I've never seen a judge that angry." When court resumed 30 minutes later, Judge Cameron returned with a stack of papers and an expression that made Derek's attorney sit up straighter. The kind of face lawyers learn to read as bad news for their client. The judge didn't waste time with preliminaries, just launched directly into her observations, saying, "I've reviewed the recordings submitted by the minor child, cross-referenced them with the testimony and evidence presented this morning, and I have serious concerns about the conduct of both Mr. Parker and his mother throughout these proceedings." Patricia was already writing, her pen flying across her legal pad, and I sat perfectly still while Judge Cameron continued. "The court is entering an immediate order, freezing all asset transfers pending a full financial review. I'm reopening the question of temporary financial arrangements because the evidence supporting those restrictions appears to have been manufactured or grossly exaggerated, and I'm ordering both parties to submit to evaluation by a court-appointed psychologist, not one selected by either side." Derek's face went pale, that sick grayish color people turn when they realize they've lost something they thought was secure. And Eleanor was gripping the railing of the gallery so hard her knuckles were white. Judge Cameron wasn't finished. She looked directly at Eleanor and said, "Ma'am, I'm also issuing a warning that any further interference in these proceedings from non-parties, including coaching witnesses or attempting to influence testimony, may result in sanctions including contempt charges. Do you understand?" And Eleanor had to say yes through gritted teeth. The ruling continued for another 10 minutes. Judge Cameron methodically dismantling every advantage Derek and Eleanor had built over 6 months of manipulation, questioning the affidavits that had been submitted about my mental state, demanding medical records to support claims of instability, ordering a new hearing in 30 days with full financial disclosure from both parties. She looked at me directly, the first time she'd really focused on me rather than on Derek or the attorneys, and said, "Mrs. Parker, I apologize that this court granted temporary orders based on incomplete and apparently false information that will be corrected." I nodded because I didn't trust my voice not to crack. Didn't trust myself not to cry in front of everyone, and Patricia squeezed my hand under the table in silent celebration. Derek tried one last time, standing and saying, "Your Honor, I want to clarify that we never intended to mislead the court." And Judge Cameron's response was ice cold. "Your intentions are irrelevant, Mr. Parker. Your actions spoke clearly in those recordings." Then she did something I didn't expect. She addressed Eleanor directly again, her voice cutting across the courtroom. "Mrs. Parker, I'm formally ordering you to have no contact with these proceedings going forward. You will not discuss this case with your son. You will not communicate with his attorney. You will not be present at future hearings. And if I find evidence that you violated this order, I will hold you in contempt. Am I clear?" Eleanor's confident mask finally shattered completely, her face flushing dark red as she stammered, "Yes, Your Honor," like the words were choking her. The immediate aftermath felt surreal, like stepping out of a dark room into sudden sunlight that hurt my eyes after so long in shadow. And Derek's attorney was gathering papers with sharp, angry movements, while Derek sat motionless at the table, staring at nothing. Eleanor had already left the courtroom, pushed through the doors so fast she nearly knocked someone over. And I imagined her in the hallway, seething with rage at being publicly reprimanded, at having her authority demolished in a single sentence from a judge who saw through every manipulation. Patricia was packing up her briefcase, telling me what would happen next. the timeline for the financial review, and the psychological evaluations in the new hearing. But I was only half listening because I was watching Bailey across the room, sitting between her parents with her hands folded in her lap, exactly like mine had been at the beginning of this hearing. My son Andrew looked shell-shocked, his face pale as he processed what he'd just learned about his father and grandmother, and his wife had her arm around Bailey's shoulders, protective and proud. The bailiff was ushering people out because court was done for the day. And as I stood to leave, Derek turned toward me, opened his mouth like he wanted to say something. But I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in months. And he must have seen something in my face that made him think better of it, because he closed his mouth and turned away. The final ruling came 4 weeks later, after the financial review and court-ordered psychological evaluations that found absolutely nothing wrong with my mental state or cognitive function, and Judge Cameron awarded me an equitable division of assets, reinstated spousal support at a level that reflected 32 years of marriage, and shifted responsibility for legal fees to Derek because of the bad faith conduct throughout these proceedings. It wasn't revenge, wasn't about making Derek suffer or punishing him for leaving. It was simply consequences, the natural result of trying to manipulate a court and getting caught doing it. Patricia negotiated a clean separation with no ongoing contact required beyond what was legally necessary, and Derek signed everything without argument, because his attorney had advised him that fighting would only make things worse and potentially expose him to civil liability for emotional distress. I walked out of that final hearing feeling lighter than I had in a year. Not because I'd won something, but because I'd been seen, because the truth had mattered, because a 12-year-old girl had been brave enough to speak up when adults who should have known better chose cruelty disguised as concern. There was no dramatic scene, no yelling or tears or final confrontations, just the quiet satisfaction of justice delivered through proper channels, of being proven right after months of being told I was wrong about everything, including my own mind. Derek tried to apologize 3 weeks after the final ruling, showed up at my new apartment without calling first, holding flowers from the grocery store and wearing that expression men get when they're sorry they got caught, rather than sorry for what they did. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. Stood in the doorway and let him say his piece about how things got out of hand. How his mother had pushed harder than he'd intended. How he still cared about me, even though the marriage was over. I listened without interrupting. And when he finished, I said simply, "Derek, you laughed about breaking me down. I heard you on that recording. You thought it was funny that your mother was destroying my sense of reality." And he flinched like I'd slapped him. He tried to explain, to contextualize, to make it somehow less awful than it was. But I'd heard enough explanations and excuses to last a lifetime. So I told him the flowers weren't necessary, and that our attorneys could handle any future communication, and closed the door on 32 years of marriage without drama or regret. Later that same week, Eleanor sent a letter, 3 pages of careful handwriting explaining her side, how she'd only wanted what was best for Derek, how she'd felt I wasn't strong enough to handle the divorce and had tried to help in her own way, and I read it once and put it in my shredder because her version of help had nearly destroyed me, and I wasn't interested in her justifications. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I was living in a small 2-bedroom apartment across town, had reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with during the marriage, and had started volunteering at a women's shelter, helping people navigate legal systems that often felt designed to intimidate and exhaust them. Bailey visited every weekend, and we'd established a ritual of Saturday morning breakfast at a diner near my apartment where she'd tell me about school and friends and her worries about getting older, and I'd listen without trying to fix everything. Just being present the way the adults in my life should have been present for me. We never talked much about the recordings or the hearing, didn't need to rehash what we'd both lived through. But one Saturday, she asked quietly if I was mad at her for not telling me about the recordings sooner. And I looked at this brave, intelligent girl who'd carried such a heavy secret and said, "Bailey, You did something incredibly difficult. You stood up in a courtroom full of adults and told the truth when it would have been easier to stay quiet. I could never be mad at you for that." She nodded and took a sip of her orange juice and said, "Grandma Eleanor told my dad I ruined everything." And I felt a flash of anger at Eleanor for putting that on a child. But I just said, "You didn't ruin anything. You exposed something that was already broken. There's a big difference." Rebuilding my life took longer than I expected, not because of practical challenges. The settlement gave me financial stability, and I'd always been good with money despite what Derek and Eleanor had claimed. But because recovering from gaslighting means relearning how to trust your own mind, your own memories, your own perception of reality. I started therapy with a counselor who specialized in emotional abuse, and she helped me understand that what I'd experienced had a name, had patterns, wasn't my fault or my failure. I reclaimed hobbies I'd abandoned during the marriage, started painting again like I had in college, joined a book club, took a pottery class at the community center, small things that were just for me, without needing to justify them or explain them or make them fit someone else's schedule. My apartment was smaller than the house I'd lived in with Derek, but it was mine, decorated the way I wanted, operating on my timeline, and I could leave my keys on the counter without someone moving them to make a point. The quiet victory wasn't in the courtroom ruling or the settlement. It was in these small, daily moments of autonomy, in making decisions without second-guessing myself, in trusting that my memory of events was valid and accurate without needing external validation. I think about that divorce hearing sometimes, about the moment Bailey stood up with her phone and changed everything. And I realize that justice doesn't always look like dramatic confrontations or revenge served cold or villains getting their deserved punishment in obvious ways. Sometimes justice looks like a 12-year-old girl being brave enough to press record, like a judge patient enough to listen when a child says something's wrong, like a legal system that occasionally actually works the way it's supposed to. Truth doesn't need to be shouted or forced or defended with elaborate arguments when it's documented clearly, when it speaks for itself through recordings that can't be denied or reframed or explained away. And sometimes the smallest voice in the room, the quietest person who nobody's really paying attention to, carries the most power because they're the ones actually seeing what's happening while everyone else is too busy performing their roles. The courtroom went silent when those recordings played, but my life finally found its voice, found its solid ground, found its way back to something that felt like truth after months of living in someone else's manufactured reality. And that silence, that moment of collective recognition that something terrible had been exposed, was the beginning of everything changing.